In the morning of the 24th of August, 1969, Alpha Company has been fighting in the valley below for 5 days. It came in with 95 men. 52 are still on their feet. 8 are dead. Nobody in the company has seen a single enemy soldier, and nobody believes they have killed one. At the bottom of the slope lie the bodies of a lieutenant and a sergeant, 3 days in the sun, and the order that morning is to go down and bring them out. The men will not move. Their commander has been leading them for 17 days. He picks up the radio handset and tells his colonel the truth.
"I am sorry, sir, but my men refuse to go. We cannot move out."
In the southern reach of I Corps, roughly 30 miles south of Da Nang, this ground belonged to the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, commanded by Colonel Thomas Tackerberry, and assigned to the Americal Division under Major General Lloyd Ramsey. The Americal's other 2 brigades operated further south against booby traps and guerrilla ambush. The 196th drew the other kind of war. Its 4-line battalions sat on fire bases named Baldy, Center, West, Siberia, and Professional, and from those hilltops they went down into 2 valleys where North Vietnamese regulars held prepared bunker systems. One was Heap Duc, the other was the Song Chang, which the infantry called AK Valley, and the correspondents would eventually call Death Valley. Between the 12th and the 29th of August, American commands across South Vietnam recorded a coordinated series of attacks that MACV filed under the bland heading of the 1969 Summer Offensive. In the 196th's area, it fell hardest on the fire bases and the companies working below them. The timing is worth holding on to, because it came barely 2 months after President Nixon announced at Midway the withdrawal of the first 25,000 American troops. Strategy had formally shifted to Vietnamization. Rifle companies were still expected to close with an entrenched enemy under a policy whose declared purpose was to leave, and that contradiction was not lost on the men carrying the rifles. The immediate chain of events began with a helicopter. On the 19th of August, 2 Hueys were shot down over the valley. Aboard one was Lieutenant Colonel Illy Howard, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 21st Infantry, a unit that carried the regimental nickname Gimlets. Howard was killed with 7 others, among them the Associated Press photographer Oliver Noonan. For the next week, the battalion's operations were organized around one objective: reaching the wreckage and recovering the remains. Recovery of the dead is a non-negotiable obligation in any army, and no officer in that chain would have entertained abandoning it. At the level of the rifle squad, the calculation looked different. The men had a phrase for it: dying for the dead. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bacon arrived from a staff position at Chu Lai on the 20th of August to take the battalion. He had spent his first tour advising South Vietnamese forces and was by every account a capable professional. He was also a stranger brought in over officers already serving, and he inherited a unit that had been in continuous contact for a week. Alpha Company's condition was the product of a longer decline. On the 3rd of August, it was pulled to Chu Lai for a stand-down, where a floor show ended in a brawl with the battalion reconnaissance element. Howard cancelled the stand-down as punishment and assembled the company at the helipad next morning. Some men were still drunk, some were missing, still at the beach. They boarded Chinooks expecting a return to the firebase and learned in flight that they were making a combat assault instead. They landed beside a North Vietnamese company. Within 15 minutes they were in contact, and one of the company's 2 effective platoon leaders, First Lieutenant Harvey Brown, was shot through the forearm and evacuated to the United States. 2 days later, Howard relieved the company commander, Captain Dennis Chudoba, over a disputed call for artillery. His replacement was First Lieutenant Eugene Schertz, a distinguished military graduate of his ROTC class, Ranger qualified, regular Army, son of a career lieutenant colonel. He had commanded infantry in the field for 17 days when the refusal happened. What those 17 days contained explains the rest. On the 20th, Bravo Company filed into a bunker complex and was caught in a prepared ambush from the front and both flanks. 5 men were killed and 24 wounded, including the platoon leader, First Lieutenant Turpin, who died of a chest wound after a medevac was refused as too dangerous to attempt. Alpha took casualties of its own, sending volunteers into that fire to drag Bravo's wounded back. On the 21st, Alpha took the point. Second Lieutenant Kirschgessler, the only platoon leader in the company with real experience, was killed moving toward the heaviest firing. Schurz ordered the platoon to pull back without the body, a decision he never forgave himself for and could see no alternative to. On the 22nd, going back for Kirschgessler, Sergeant Dervin Pitts was killed. Going back for Pitts, Private First Class Ray Barker was shot in the head. On the 23rd, the battalion finally took Hill 102, the knoll the whole fight had been organized around. Airstrikes, artillery, and napalm worked it over twice. The second advance drew 4 mortar rounds and a hill was taken. What the infantry found on the crest were empty bunkers and their own old foxholes from the June fight. No enemy dead, no captured equipment. In Nolan's summary, just a hill of dirt. By the following morning, the arithmetic inside Alpha Company was not in dispute. The company had entered the valley with 95 men. 8 had been killed. 52 were still standing. Roughly 4 in 10 of those were replacements with less than a month in the field. Resupply had been sporadic for days because the same crossfire that pinned the infantry kept the helicopters out. Men had gone without water resupply in heat that dropped casualties on the march, and some had chewed bark off trees. There had been no mail and no hot food. Across 5 days of attacks into the same bunker line, the company had produced no confirmed enemy dead. Most of the men had not laid eyes on a North Vietnamese soldier. The composition of that company explains a great deal about what came next. The American ground war was fought on an individual replacement system with a fixed tour of 365 days. A man arrived alone, joined a unit of strangers, and left alone on his own rotation date. Units did not rotate together, so a rifle company was never a stable body of men. It was a rolling population in which the experienced were continuously subtracted and the untrained continuously added, and by late August that process had run past the point where Alpha Company could absorb it. The system also produced a psychology the Army never solved. Willingness to accept risk was not constant across a tour. It declined, sharply and predictably, as the rotation date approached, because the closer a man came to going home, the more each remaining day cost him. When Schurz told his colonel there were men on that hill with 90 days left, he was not offering an excuse. He was describing the exact category of soldier the replacement system had taught to count. Specialist 4 John Curtis was one of those men, and his case complicates any easy reading of what occurred. Curtis was 19, a squad leader in 3rd Platoon, in country since November of 1968, with the word peace inked across his helmet cover. In March, when his platoon was ambushed, he had dragged 2 wounded men back to the medics and then crawled forward with a radio to put artillery onto the enemy tree line. He wore a silver star for it. He had been running the platoon himself for months between lieutenants, not because his background was unusual, but because he had the personality for it. His father was a construction worker in Tennessee. He had enlisted straight out of high school on the reasoning that the draft was going to take him regardless. On the 24th, which the men called Black Sunday, Curtis came back off R&R on the morning resupply bird. He had heard about the battle while checking in at the battalion rear in Chu Lai, where soldiers who knew he was a short timer and a point man advised him to make himself scarce until things cooled down. One friend told him flatly that if he went out to the valley, he would be killed. Curtis caught the flight to the firebase anyway. He had no affection for the army and no interest in who held the valley. He went because his squad was, in his own understanding of the word, family. That distinction separates Nui Lon from the political resistance spreading through the American military in the same period. Curtis had come in apolitical and stayed that way. What he had lost faith in was not the war as an abstraction, but the competence of the people sending him into specific ground. The loyalty that survived was horizontal, and it ran nowhere else. Stepping off the helicopter, the first thing that registered was shock. The entire squad of his friend Tom Goodwin had ceased to exist. In his own squad, 2 of the original men were left. Minutes later, his platoon was told it had point for the next attack. That attack was narrow in scope, and precision matters here, because the coverage blurred it. Bacon spent that morning on the valley floor with Bravo Company, moving the dead from the burned Huey to Graves registration at Hawk Hill. That was the helicopter crash the newspapers referred to. Alpha's task was separate and smaller. The company was to move down the slope of Nui Lon to the bunkers at its base and recover Kirkesgler and Pitts. Brigade intelligence assessed the complex as abandoned. The assessment was correct. The men did not believe it, and their reasoning was not irrational. They had been sent down that slope repeatedly and thrown back every time by fire from positions they could not locate, and they had lost their most experienced leaders doing it. The enemy in that valley absorbed air and artillery under overhead cover and then engaged at close range, which meant a preparation that looked devastating from a firebase produced nothing on the ground. From where those men were standing, the phrase "the bunkers are empty" carried no evidential weight at all. It was the same voice on the same radio that had been wrong every previous morning. They also understood what the risk was for. Not to seize ground, which they had taken and walked away from twice. They were being asked to accept the chance of dying in order to carry out 2 men who were already dead. The refusal began, as these things do, with a delay rather than a declaration. 2 men in Curtis's squad, Jay Curtis and Steve Niebuhr, told him they could not go back without reinforcements, that it was suicide, and that they had agreed to stick together and demand to see the Inspector General. They wanted Curtis to carry it to the company commander. He balked, since he had never so much as spoken to Schurz, then went on the strength of his trust in their judgment. The platoon did not move. Schurz eventually walked up to ask what the delay was. Curtis laid out the complaints and was backed by Jay, Steve, and the platoon medic. They wanted a helicopter and an audience with the Inspector General before another attack was ordered. Schurz tried persuasion. What he could not fall back on was the presumption he had been trained under, that soldiers receive orders and carry them out. His 2 surviving platoon leaders were no use, because they were repeating their men's objections and saying they could not see ordering anyone back into those bunkers. Schurz reached for the radio, and the exchange that followed is the reason this episode is remembered.
I am sorry, sir, but my men refuse to go. We cannot move out.
Repeat that, please. Have you told them what it means to disobey orders under fire?
I think they understood, but some of them simply had enough. They are broken. There are boys here who have only 90 days left in Vietnam. They want to go home in one piece. The situation is psychic.
Are you talking about enlisted men, or are the NCOs also involved?
That's the difficulty here. We've got a leadership problem. Most of our squad and platoon leaders have been killed or wounded.
Bacon then did the only sensible thing available at that distance. He told Schurz to go back and explain that the bunkers were believed empty, that the enemy had withdrawn, that the mission was to recover their own dead, and to take a hand count of how many men genuinely would not go. Schurz came back a few minutes later and reported that they would not go, and that he had not taken the count because he was afraid they would all stand together, even though some might privately prefer to move. That answer is the hinge of the whole episode. By Nolan's reconstruction, the number actively refusing was a handful of short-timers. The rest of the company was not in revolt. They were frozen, waiting to see which way it would break, and their calculation was that they had more confidence in their own combat experience than in the judgment of a lieutenant with 17 days in the bush. By declining to count, Schurz converted a manageable problem inside one platoon into a formal refusal by an entire company, and he did it over a net that other people were monitoring. What failed on Nui Lon was not primarily courage. It was the assumption that an order carries authority independent of the man issuing it. Nolan's judgment on the point is unsentimental. Rational discussion does not always get the job done. Before making the refusal official on the radio, the company commander could have told the dissidents plainly that they would be taken out for court-martial, then turned to the rest and led them down the hill. Schurz had no such experience to draw on. Very few lieutenants would have. Command turbulence in that battalion had reached a level difficult to defend in any professional army. The company commander had been relieved 18 days earlier, and his replacement had never led men in combat. The battalion commander had been killed 5 days earlier, and his replacement had 4 days in the job. The one platoon leader with the standing to hold the company together had been dead for 3 days. Of the squad and platoon leaders who normally carry an order the last few yards from officer to rifleman, most were dead or in hospital. None of this was peculiar to Alpha Company. The Army's practice of rotating officers through command assignments in roughly 6 months, adopted to spread career qualifying experience across a large officer corps, left the institutional memory of a battalion with enlisted men who had no authority to act on it. An enemy holding the same bunker line with the same tactics for 2 years faced a succession of American commanders who each had to learn that ground from scratch. A further factor worked against company officers, and it was peculiar to that war. In earlier conflicts, a captain could present an order as his own. In Vietnam, the company command post was a man with a radio surrounded by other men within earshot, and orders came down from battalion and brigade on nets everyone could hear. A company commander in the 196th described the consequence afterwards. The men had already heard the colonel tell the captain to take the hill. They knew the colonel was not coming with them. Nobody had explained why the hill was worth taking, particularly since they had taken it twice already and walked off it each time. Nothing was left to bridge that gap except an officer's personal standing with his soldiers, and Schurz had none yet. A broader resentment ran through the gimlets and predated all of this. Platoons were rarely at full strength and supplies were chronically short. A good many of the men had concluded they were pawns being spent so somebody else could make full colonel. That reading was unfair to most of the officers involved. From inside a rifle platoon on the 5th day of a losing fight, it was also close to unarguable. Schurz grasped the isolation only in retrospect. 2 nights before the refusal, on the crest of Nui Lon with his surviving lieutenants, he listened to them call the operation stupid and suicidal, then heard the conversation drift into an angry search for why any of them were in Vietnam at all. He argued they had a duty to serve and possibly to die there. One of the platoon leaders told him that would be the greatest waste of all. He was a career officer's son, commanding drafted teenagers, and the distance between them had nothing to do with rank. The resolution came faster than the coverage would ever suggest. Before any help arrived from battalion, Schurz went to Curtis one final time and made it a direct, unambiguous order. As far as Curtis was concerned, that ended it. He did not consider himself a mutineer, and once the man with the silver bar left him no other choice, he and the rest of Alpha Company started moving, reluctantly and angrily, but moving. Then the battalion command helicopter landed on the hill and the men sat back down in the elephant grass. Bacon had instructed his executive officer, Major Richard Waite, and his battalion sergeant major, Sergeant First Class Oki Blankenship, to fly down and get the company going again with what he described as a pep talk and a kick in the butt. One of the men was crying. The balking started over. Waite took the sympathetic approach and listened while Curtis sketched out what the company had been through. Blankenship took the other one. He ridiculed them and invented a story about another company still advancing with 15 men left. When Jay asked why that company would do it, Blankenship sneered back that perhaps those men had something a little more than he had. Jay came at him with his fists balled, shouting that they were not cowards. Curtis, watching, took Blankenship for a pompous rear area lifer freshly arrived in country. He had it exactly backwards. Blankenship was on his 3rd tour, held a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts, and came from the coal country of Panther, West Virginia, the eldest of 8 children born to Mose and Waddy Blankenship. He was a high school dropout, divorced 3 times, hot-tempered, over 6 feet, and better than 200 pounds. He had become battalion sergeant major only because the previous command ship was shot down, and before that had been running operations from inside the bunker, a job he knew had gone to his waistline. Rucking up to fly out that morning, he was handed salt tablets for the heat as a joke and laughed that he might well need them. Blankenship turned and walked down the slope. Behind him, the company picked up its rifles and followed. The bunkers were empty. The North Vietnamese had pulled out, exactly as Brigade intelligence had assessed. The only things at the bottom of that hill were the bodies of Kirsch Gessler and Pitts, which the August sun had been working on for days. The men bagged them, carried them to a clearing, and called a medevac. The whole refusal, from the first delay to the movement downhill, had lasted about an hour. The next morning, the 25th of August, Bacon flew to the company's position with Captain Bernhard Wolpers aboard. No charges were brought against any soldier. Bacon relieved Schurz on the spot and put Wolpers, a hard soldier with a heavy German accent, in command, one necessary step in getting a worn-out battalion back on its feet. Schurz was destroyed by it. When Bacon took over the Gimlets, Schurz had thought he finally had a calm and rational superior to work for, and the first thing that superior did was fire him. There were tears in his eyes. Alpha Company stayed in the valley without further contact until the 31st, then walked back up to the firebase for its turn on bunker watch. A crowd of journalists was waiting. That was the moment the men discovered their company was famous, and that the exchange between their lieutenant and their colonel had been taken down by reporters who overheard it at the battalion base. The dispatch by Horst Fass and Peter Arnett of the Associated Press ran in the New York Times on the 26th of August and on front pages internationally. Much of the coverage used the phrase grunt revolt, with its implication of an organized militant underground. As Nolan points out, comparable incidents had occurred repeatedly in the Second World War and in Korea without anyone reaching for that language. Very few observers grasped that these were ordinary soldiers in a company that had seen one battle too many. One of the reporters at the firebase was James Sturber, and his observation is the sharpest single comment anyone made about the affair. Army policy held that a man who re-enlisted would be taken out of the infantry, and the Americans sent a re-enlistment sergeant round every firebase every 2 weeks. One landed at Landing Zone Center the same day the company came up out of the valley with half the men it had started with. The world-famous company that had refused for an hour to go to war was invited to sign on for 3 more years, on the condition that none of them would be spent out there. An officer described the sergeant's results that day as outstanding. The account did not go unchallenged. Time magazine attacked the reporting in its issue of the 8th of September, noting that neither correspondent had spoken to anyone in the company directly and calling the account exaggerated. On the 2nd of September, Curtis told the Pittsburgh Press that they had never at any point said they would not go down the hill, and that when Schurz gave a direct order, they started moving. Bacon spent decades afterwards arguing the same case in stronger terms. No direct order was ever issued, he maintained, therefore there was no mutiny and no refusal. By that reading, the only man who refused an order that day was the lieutenant who declined to pass one on, and even he relented inside an hour. Bacon also pointed to conditions largely absent from the coverage, including areas of responsibility 2 to 3 times larger than his battalion could clear with any confidence, no roads, and no reserve that could reach him. Schurz was moved quietly out of the field. Most of those who knew the circumstances judged his failure to be inexperience rather than any absence of courage, and considered him a scapegoat. To his superiors, he had wavered where he should have charged, and he had embarrassed the division in front of a hostile press. He was reassigned as an assistant brigade personnel officer at Landing Zone Baldy, promoted to captain, and finished his tour at Chu Lai as brigade stand-down officer. He was discharged in July of 1970 with an end-of-tour Bronze Star and an Army Commendation Medal. Bacon retired as a colonel. The larger significance of Nui Lon lies in what followed it. Combat refusal was not new, and versions of it are documented in American units in both previous wars. What changed was frequency and visibility. In 1971, Colonel Robert Heinl published an assessment in the Armed Forces Journal, arguing that the army remaining in Vietnam was approaching collapse, and the figures he assembled describe a curve rather than an event. For the entire United States Army in Vietnam in 1968, across more than 7 divisions, 68 refusals were officially recorded. In 1970, the 1st Cavalry Division alone admitted 35. Official records of assaults with explosive devices on American officers and non-commissioned officers run to roughly 900 documented or suspected cases between 1969 and 1972, and every serious study treats that as an undercount. The 196th carried the reputation for the rest of its existence. A second reported refusal followed in 1972, when elements of the brigade at Da Nang were said to have declined an order to support South Vietnamese units resisting the offensive of that spring. The brigade was deactivated early in the post-war drawdown, then reactivated in 1998 at Fort Shafter, Hawaii, as a reserve component training brigade responsible for units across the Pacific. What happened on that ridge was a company reaching the end of what it could produce, and an officer without the standing to carry it past that point. The Army's response was to relieve the lieutenant, charge nobody, and offer the survivors a way out of the infantry if they signed for 3 more years. None of that touched the conditions that produced the morning, because none of it could. To a length, the replacement system, the command rotation policy, and the decision to keep attacking bunker lines in a war the United States had already announced it was leaving were set far above the level of a battalion. Alpha Company was simply the place where those decisions met a slope with 2 bodies at the bottom of it, in front of a reporter with a notebook.